Meanwhile, a northern politician brought on the specter of Napoleon for a different purpose. Early in January 1865, Francis P. Blair made a journey to Richmond and proposed to Davis a plan of reconciliation involving the complete abandonment of slavery, the reunion of all the states, and an expedition against Mexico in which Davis was to play the leading role. Davis cautiously refrained from committing himself, though he gave Blair a letter in which he expressed his willingness to enter into negotiations for peace between the two countries. The visit of Blair gave new impetus to the peace intrigue. The Confederate House Committee on Foreign Affairs reported resolutions favoring an attempt to negotiate with the United States so as to bring into view the possibility of cooperation between the United States and the Confederacy to maintain the Monroe Doctrine. The same day saw another singular incident. For some reason that has never been divulged, Foote determined to counterbalance Blair's visit to Richmond by a visit of his own to Washington. In attempting to pass through the Confederate lines, he was arrested by the military authorities. With this fiasco, Foote passed from the stage of history. The doings of Blair, however, continued to be a topic of general interest throughout January. The military intrigue was now simmering down through the creation of the office of Commanding General. The attempt of the congressional opposition to drive the whole cabinet from office reached a compromise in the single retirement of the Secretary of War. Before the end of the month, the peace question was the paramount one before Congress and the country. Newspapers discussed the movements of Blair, apparently with little knowledge, and some of the papers asserted hopefully that peace was within reach. Cooler heads, such as the majority of the Virginia legislature, rejected this idea as baseless. The Mercury called the peace party the worst enemy of the South. Lee was reported by the Richmond correspondent of the Mercury as not caring a fig for the peace project. Nevertheless, the rumor persisted that Blair had offered peace on terms that the Confederacy could accept. Late in the month, Davis appointed Stephens, Hunter, and John A. Campbell commissioners to confer with the Northern authorities with regard to peace. There followed the famous conference of February 3, 1865, in the cabin of the steamer at Hampton Roads with Seward and Lincoln. The Confederate commissioners represented two points of view: that of the administration, unwilling to make peace without independence, and that of the infatuated Stephens, who clung to the idea that Lincoln did not mean what he said, and who now urged an armistice allowing the states to adjust themselves as suited their interest. If it would be to their interest to reunite, they would do so. The refusal of Lincoln to consider either of these points of view, the refusal so clearly foreseen by Davis, put an end to the career of Stephens. The news of the failure of the conference was variously received. The Mercury rejoiced because there was now no doubt how things stood. Stephens, unwilling to cooperate with the administration, left the capital and went home to Georgia. At Richmond, though the snow lay thick on the ground, a great public meeting was held on the 6th of February in the precincts of the African Church. Here Davis made an address which has been called his greatest and which produced a profound impression. A wave of enthusiasm swept over Richmond, and for a moment the President appeared once more to be master of the situation. His immense audacity carried the people with him when, after showing what might be done by more drastic enforcement of the conscription laws, he concluded, "Let us then unite our hands and our hearts, lock our shields together, and we may well believe that before another summer solstice falls upon us, it will be the enemy that will be asking us for conferences and occasions in which to make known our demands." Almost from the moment when the South had declared its independence, voices had been raised in favor of arming the Negroes. The rejection of a plan to accomplish this was one of the incidents of Benjamin's tenure of the portfolio of the War Department. But it was not until the early days of 1864, when the forces of Johnston lay encamped at Dalton, Georgia, that the arming of the slaves was seriously discussed by a council of officers. Even then, the proposal had its determined champions, though there were others among Johnston's officers who regarded it as contrary to all true principles of warfare, and their votes prevailed in the council by a large majority. From that time forward, the question of arming the slaves hung like a heavy cloud over all Confederate thought of the war. It was discussed in the army and at home around troubled firesides. Letters written from the trenches at Petersburg show that it was debated by the soldiers, and the intense repugnance which the idea inspired in some minds was shown by threats to leave the ranks if the slaves were given arms. Amid the pressing, obvious issues of 1864, this project hardly appears upon the face of the record until it was alluded to in Davis's message to Congress in November 1864 and in the annual report of the Secretary of War. The President did not as yet ask for slave soldiers. He did, however, ask for the privilege of buying slaves for government use, not merely hiring them from their owners as had hitherto been done, and for permission, if the government so desired, to emancipate them at the end of their service. The Secretary of War went farther, however, and advocated Negro soldiers, and he too suggested their emancipation at the end of service. This feeling of the temper of the country, so to speak, produced an immediate response. It drew Rhett from his retirement and inspired a letter in which he took the government severely to task for designing to remove from state control the matters of fundamental importance. Coinciding with the cry for more troops with which to confront Sherman, the topic of Negro soldiers became at once one of the questions of the hour. It helped to force that violent anti-Davis movement, which is the conspicuous event of December 1864 and January 1865. Those who believed the President unscrupulously trembled at the thought of putting into his hands a great army of hardy barbarians trained to absolute obedience. The prospect of such a weapon held in one firm hand at Richmond seemed to those opponents of the President a greater menace to their liberties than even the armies of the invaders. It is quite likely that distrust of Davis and dread of the use he might make of such a weapon was increased by a letter from Benjamin to Frederick A. Porcher of Charleston, a supporter of the government, who had made rash suggestions as to the extra constitutional power that the administration might be justified by circumstances in assuming. Benjamin depreciated such suggestions, but concluded with the unfortunate remark, "If the Constitution is not to be our guide, I would prefer to see it suppressed by a revolution which should declare a dictatorship during the war after the manner of ancient Rome, leaving to the future the care of reestablishing firm and regular government. In the state of Virginia, indeed, the revolutionary suggestions of the President's message and the Secretary's report were promptly taken up and made the basis of a political program which Governor Smith embodied in his message to the legislature, a document that will eventually take its place among the most interesting state papers of the Confederacy. It should be noted that the suggestions thrown out in this way by the administration to test public feeling involve three distinct questions. Should the slaves be given arms? Should they, if employed as soldiers, be given their freedom? Should this revolutionary scheme, if accepted at all, be handled by the general government or left to the several states? On the last of the three questions, the governor of Virginia was silent. By implication, he treated the matter as a concern of the states. Upon the first and second questions, however, he was explicit and advised arming the slaves. He then added, "Even if the results were to emancipate our slaves, there is not a man who would not cheerfully put the Negro into the army rather than become a slave himself to our hated and vindictive foe. It is then simply a question of time. Has the time arrived when this issue is fairly before us? For my part, standing before God and my country, I do not hesitate to say that I would arm such portions of our able-bodied slave population as may be necessary and put them in the field so as to have them ready for the spring campaign, even if it resulted in the freedom of those thus organized. Will I not employ them to fight the Negro force of the enemy, of the Yankees themselves, who already boast that they have 200,000 of our slaves in arms against us? Can we hesitate? Can we doubt when the question is whether the enemy shall use our slaves against us or we use them against him, when the question may be between liberty and independence on the one hand or our subjugation and utter ruin on the other?